All right. AngularUP, how's everybody doing? There we go. My name is John Crowson. I'm just a developer that contributes to NgRx in his free time. My official title is Senior Software Engineer at Capital One. Coming to you guys all the way from Washington, D.C. This is my second time in Tel Aviv. It's been awesome being here again. I've been excited about all the talks you guys have gotten to see, all the excellent talks coming out this afternoon. And foremost, I'm excited to tell you guys about testing with MockStore and NgRx version 8. So what we're going to be talking about today is not about testing elements of NgRx itself. So we're not going to be talking about testing effects or reducers or selectors. There's plenty of other talks that go into that. What I'm going to be talking about is testing any Angular class that injects the NgRx store. And usually in Angular, we're talking about our components and our services. So I'm going to start off really briefly about talking what do we want to test. And then we're going to talk about testing depth, both looking at integration tests and unit tests. And then we're going to look at unit testing in NgRx version 6 and earlier, specifically some of the drawbacks in the recommended approaches. And then finally, I'm going to talk about our improved unit testing with MockStore and MockSelectors, released in version 7 and version 8 of NgRx. This is really bleeding edge stuff. Version 8 just came out last week. There was a chance this was going to be completely beta. I was really excited about that possibility, but it is officially out and you guys can play with everything I'm showing today. And in order to look at some examples, we're going to do components and we're going to look at some services. So you guys should be, if you use NgRx, be familiar with this diagram. And this is the general data flow of NgRx. So our components and services are responsible for dispatching actions. Those actions are intercepted by our reducer, which uses the previous state along with the action to generate a new state, which is put into our store. Our effects optionally can intercept those actions and perform side effects, main example being performing an API call. And then those effects dispatch actions as well. And finally, our components and services listen to the latest state and from the store using selectors, which allow us to pick out a very specific piece of state. And so when we're talking about components and services, what do we want to test? Two main things is that we want to test that our actions are dispatched at the appropriate time and that they have the correct payload associated with them. In essence, the data that we pass along with our actions. And then secondly, we want to look at the behavior of our components based on a given NgRx state. And when I talk about component testing, we usually talk about two types of tests. About 20% of our tests should be integration tests, where we're more concerned about the interaction of our component with real dependencies. And when I'm talking about dependencies today, I'm going to be talking about the dependency on the NgRx store. And then unit tests, we're more concerned about the behavior of the component with mock dependencies. So when I'm writing an integration test with NgRx, I'm not going to mock any of the related effects or the store or selectors. I'm just going to set it up using StoreModule and the effects module. That's the exact same way I would set up NgRx if I was installing it in my app module. But in my integration test, I'm going to install it in my testing module. And then with unit tests, I'm going to mock the store or the individual selectors completely. But how do I do that? So if our goal is to condition the mock state to assert our component behavior, in NgRx version 6, the documentation told us to import the store module in our testing module, and then dispatch a sequence of actions in order to condition the state that we wanted to test against. Let's take a look at how that looked. So in our testing module, we import the store module along with the relevant reducers. If we have a very basic test that's just looking to see that based on the store, we're just showing all of the items, we would have to dispatch a real action to that store to, for here example, load some data. Now, the first problem I see here is that load data success, usually something with this name schema, is something that's going to be dispatched from an effect. So a lot of times to condition my data, I'm having to dispatch actions that my component usually should never even know about. Secondly, I have to know how this action and the reducers work together to manipulate state. I'm trying to condition a very specific state, and I have to know a lot about actions and reducers and how my app behaves in order to condition that state. And then on top of that, as my actions and reducers change as I continue to iterate on my app, I'm having to go back and change this completely unrelated test in order to just condition my data. And then finally, as the condition state becomes more and more complex, I'm going to have to dispatch more and more actions in order to condition it. So things can get pretty hairy here. And so in summary, dispatching actions to condition the state is kind of a hassle. So going back to our diagram, let's look at how unit testing in version 6 works. Now, because I'm not importing the effects module, I'm getting rid of the real effects. But because I'm using my store module in my unit test, I'm using everything else about NgRx. And this isn't really an isolated unit test. This is now looking more like an integration test. So what we want is a simple way to mock the NgRx store. Sorry, I didn't get the memo about cat memes only, so you'll have to take this one for what it's worth. Going to MockStore, we now import MockStore from NgRx store testing. It was released in NgRx version 7. One of my favorite things about this contribution is that it was not submitted by a maintainer of the project or anyone that had contributed before. Piotr, I believe it's Polish, he submitted his first ever pull request to release MockStore, which is really cool. And it gives us the ability to condition a given mock state within our test. And our selectors automatically use it. MockStore basically just swaps out the store. So downstream, the selectors are all the exact same. The conditioning steps are really simple. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to provide the MockStore using the provide MockStore method in our providers array in our testing module. And we're going to pass along with it the initial state that we want for all of our tests, the base state. Then, using the MockStore instance, which we're going to create, we can update the state from test to test using the MockStore's setState method and passing in the state that we want to use for that given test. So let's take a look back at our diagram. We've gotten rid of effects, and now we're able to get rid of the real-world reducers, and we're now able to directly set the state. So this is getting more shallow. This is getting more isolated. So the example I'm going to show you guys that we're going to use to test is a very basic component. It's something you'll see out of an online store where you're shopping, and the user has a cart, a shopping cart where they put in products that they want to buy. All this class is going to do is basically just show the number of items they have in their cart. And I'm going to get that information from the NgRx store. So I'm going to import the store in my constructor. Secondly, when the component gets initialized, I'm going to dispatch a load cart action in order to go fetch my data. I'm going to have two selectors. The first selector is going to be the cart size. That's basically going to look at an array of products that is in my state and select the number of products or elements that the array has. And then the loading selector is going to tell us whether or not the API call is in progress so my component can react. And then finally, I'm creating this text observable, which is combining both the loading state and the cart size. And it's going to give us, it's going to emit a string. If the loading selector is true, it's going to emit the loading string. And if it is false, we are going to emit the cart size. Pretty basic. What do we want to test? So first, we want to test the cart loading state. Loading is true, and the products may be an empty array or it may have some left over. And we expect the text observable to emit loading. Secondly, our cart loaded state. So when loading is false, we expect the cart size to emit the number of elements in the array. And then finally, on ng on init, we want to condition that load cart is dispatched. So how do we write this test? The first thing we need to do is import provide MockStore and the MockStore object. We then put that into our providers array, passing in the initial state that we want to use. In this case, I'm going to use the loading state as my base state for all of my tests. I then need to create my loading state object. And for here, loading will be true, which is how it's a loading state. You'll notice I do a cast here as well, and that's because if my state object is really large, I don't want to have to define everything within that state. I just want to define the properties that my component is actually going to use, which in this case is just the loading and the products. And then finally, I'm going to create an instance of the MockStore, and I'll use testbed to get that instance for me. So let's write some tests. First test we're going to use is that we should display the loading text if the loading selector is true. And in order to do this, I don't have to do any additional configuration, and that's because my initial state was the loading state. So here I can just assert that my loading string was emitted from my text observable. For my second test, I want to verify that we're displaying the cart size if the loading selector is false. To do this, I need to condition a new state that I'm going to use. And in order to do that, I just create another from cart state. This time, cart loading is going to be false, and my products array is just going to have one element. To set this new state for this test, I use the MockStore instances, setState method, and passing in the new state that I want to use. And then I make the same assertion, this time asserting that the cart size of 1 is emitted from my text observable. So this is much simpler. Dispatching actions one after another, as we can see, was pretty complex for a number of reasons. We now can short circuit and just give a state that we want to test. It's also a much more isolated test. Because we're not using reducers, we now just have a MockStore, our selectors, and that's it. But what you'll notice is we still have some integration. We're still using our real selectors. So how do we create an even more shallow test? And that's where MockSelectors comes into play. MockSelectors was released in NgRx version 8. The majority of it was done by Brandon Roberts. I did create some small functionality for it as well. And it gives us the ability to condition a MockSelector without mocking the entire state. And so we saw that I had to make a cast because I didn't want to create this large state object and I was only using 2 properties. Now I only have to create MockSelectors for the selectors that I use. One of my favorite parts about it is that the test complexity is not going to increase as our selector complexity does. So this is an example of a somewhat complex selector where I'm trying to get the price average of 3 different products. If I wanted my average to return true, I might have to do some small math in my head to come up with a state that's going to have an average of 2. With MockSelectors now, I can just short circuit this whole thing and have get price average return 2. And the conditioning steps are once again very simple. MockSelectors is just an extra set of functionality on top of the MockStore. So you're still going to provide the MockStore using the provide MockStore method. However, this time we don't need to pass an initial state necessarily. You can if you want, but I'm going to overwrite all my selectors individually. Then we're going to mock our selectors with the MockStore instances override selector method, passing in the selector that I want to overwrite and the value that I wanted to return. This function is also going to return us the selector that we're overwriting. And so if I save that selector reference, I can update the selectors from test to test using the selectors setResult method. Again, this is new as well. And we just pass in the value that we want to emit. So let's look back at our diagram. So now, once again, effects module is gone. No more real reducers. And also the MockStore is now optional. We still can set the state, but we're able to completely short circuit and give us a completely isolated test now using the MockStore's override selector method. So let's look back at that exact same test that we just wrote with MockStore, this time using MockSelectors. So once again, I'm going to import provide MockStore method, the MockStore object, and provide it in my providers array. Again, I don't need to pass an initial state if I don't want to, but you can. Going to get my MockStore instance. I'm then going to create 2 instances of the selector, one for the loading, one for the cart size, and I'm going to set them using the MockStore's override selector method just passing in the selector that I want to overwrite and the initial value that I wanted to return. So just like with MockStore, these are the initial values for all of my tests. Now for my first test, once again, I don't have to do any additional configuration because I'm testing my loading state. Once again, my loading state or my loading string should be emitted from my text observable. Next, I want to test that I display the cart size if the loading selector is false. What's nice here is that I don't have to overwrite or give a new state for products. I'm fine with the current cart size just being 1. So instead of having to redefine my entire state for everything that I want to use, I just have to switch out the loading selector, which is the only difference between these two tests that I want to condition. So now my loading selector should return false, and I'd make the same assertion that my cart size is 1. So this is even simpler. Once again, this is more isolated, and going from test to test, conditioning is super, super simple. So this is a big win. You might be wondering about the support for different types of ways that you use selectors. If you use string, or if you use selectors, if you use the store select method, or if you use the select RxJS operator, anything works out of the box. So I mentioned at the beginning that we wanted to test the behavior of our component based on a state, but how about verifying dispatched actions? As a reminder, in our component, on init, we are verifying that we're dispatching the load cart action. And so what I did personally in my test is we used Jasmine along with spies, and I essentially just spy on the store's dispatch method and call through it. Then when my component gets initialized, I just verify that the dispatch method was called once, and it was called with the load cart action. And this is an approach I still use. However, MockStore gives you an additional approach. MockStore has the scanned actions observable, and the scanned actions observable allows you to observe what is dispatched to our MockStore. So in this situation, once again, when my ng on init gets called, I'm expecting that my load cart observable is being emitted from my scanned actions observable. So this is really nice, and it provides us a way to, without using a specific framework, test verifying dispatch actions. So here's a look at the API that we've gotten a chance to look at. Just want to point out one or two things. First of all, in the provide MockStore, you'll notice in addition to initial state, there's also a selectors configuration option. This is used to mock selectors up front. So you can do the same mocking selectors here. However, it's not going to give you an instance back of that selector. And so if you are going to update your selector from test to test, you're probably going to want to use the override selector method instead of doing everything up front. And then secondly, we have reset selectors, which I haven't mentioned, but it allows you to clear everything that you've overridden, which is good if you want to fall back to any mock state that you provided. So at the beginning of the talk, I mentioned that we're not going to be testing elements of NgRx itself, effects or reducers or selectors. However, there is a use case that's interesting to note here, and that's effects that depend on the NgRx store. So in its constructor, it injects the NgRx store. And we do that by incorporating state using the with latest from RxJS operator and passing in a selector. Now, this is probably not a best practice. You are encouraged to, any data that you need to pass in with your action as a part of its payload from the component or the service that's dispatching it. However, there are use cases where this makes sense. So, for example, if you are using NgRx router state, and in your state you have all information about the router, and your effect wants to use that router state, it might make more sense to just incorporate it into your effect using a selector, instead of, in my component, injecting the router and then passing it along as data. Same thing with the auth state, which we'll look at in just a second, but if your effect might depend on whether or not the user is logged in, it's helpful to just incorporate that in with an effect instead of having to inject a bunch of extra stuff in our component. So let's take a look at an example of a store-dependent effect. So this effect is pretty simple. we're filtering out only we want the load cart action, and then we're incorporating the logged in state using a selector and with latest from. We then filter out those that are logged in, which leaves us with those that are not logged in. We want to do an alert asking them to please log in. So what do we want to test? Well, when load cart is dispatched, I want to test the logged in state, where is logged in is true. I don't expect any alert. And in the logged out state, where is logged in is false, I expect an alert asking the user to please log in. Let's look at an example test using mock selectors. Once again, I'm importing provide MockStore and the MockStore object from NgRx store testing. In my providers array, once again, provide MockStore. I'm spying on the Windows alert. I get an instance of my MockStore, and I use it to set the logged in selector. So my first test is that if the user is not logged in, or sorry, they are logged in, we should not alert the user. And there's some extra testing going on here, making sure that the filter is actually picking up on it. You'll notice that I'm expecting no observable to be emitted from this effect. But the key point there at the bottom is we're expecting the window alert not to have been called. And then in my next test, I'm asserting that if the user is not logged in, that we do show the alert. And all I need to do is use that logged in selector and set its result to false. And all of my tests are relatively the same. I'm expecting that my filter does not apply here, and I do get something emitted, and I expect that my window alert is called with please log in. Now, this was still relatively the same difference in difficulty between StoreModule and dispatch and mock selectors. It's still much better. However, this was a big issue on NgRx's GitHub page because a lot of people used spies to mock selectors, and this is one use case where it's really difficult to do that. You actually had to like recreate your component every time you spied. So this is a big win, especially when you're doing store-dependent effects. So in conclusion, we've looked and seen that mock selectors are really simple, and they're the most isolated form of our tests. MockStore shortly behind it, the only disadvantage is it's still using our real selectors. You might ask, well, when do I use MockStore instead of mock selectors? And there's a number of reasons, but one being, if you use a lot of your state and you have a lot of selectors in your container component, it might not make sense and it might take more code to mock out every selector than to just provide an entire state. Also, sometimes you want to look at your state together and you might want to name them states as properties. And when you do individual selectors, sometimes it can be hard to realize what my previous other selectors might look like. So it might make more sense to look at them all in combination. Jasmine spies is a common approach previously to MockStore and mock selectors, but the difficulty of setting up was a lot greater. And then we looked at the store module's dispatch and the store module plus the effects module. So that's what's new with mock selectors in NgRx version 8. But there's also a lot of other new stuff that's come out that's really exciting. One of the large efforts that NgRx is working on is limiting the boilerplate. And I looked for that GIF of Brandon Roberts yelling boilerplate from NG-Conf 2018. I could not find it, but it's a great GIF. And it's basically just saying that we're trying to limit the amount of boilerplate in our NgRx. And so one of the ways we're doing that is using creator functions. So in version 7, we now have action creators, which is a new way to create an action. These two actions are equivalent, one using the existing way of just creating a class that implements the action interface, and then now in NgRx version 7, we use the create action function. There's a lot of underlying wins for using action creators, which I won't go into today, but feel free to hop over and read some of the blogs that have been written on action creators. There's a lot of really nice under the hood stuff that you get as well. Secondly, in version 8, again, version 8 released just last week, we now have effect creators. Some of the small differences you see here are we're no longer using the effect decorator. Dispatch is now just a last parameter. And one other thing that I really like about effect creators is now, if you do not dispatch, so if dispatch is false, your effect does not emit any actions, you do not have to map back to an action to avoid a compiler error. So if dispatch is false, you can map and change your RxJS pipe to return or emit whatever you want, which is really helpful when you're incorporating other state and you're no longer just emitting an action. So that's really cool. And then finally, we have reducer creators. I know a lot of you guys have probably seen these massive switch statements in your reducer functions. Although you're still very explicit with the new create reducer creator function, it's now just a little simpler. You use these on helper functions to manipulate your state instead of individual switch statements. And then finally, we have NgRx data, which is a new first-party library for NgRx. It was originally an open source library called Angular NgRx data, built from John Papa and Ward Bell. And it's basically just an extension on top of NgRx to simplify our entity management. And it just abstracts some of the common NgRx entity patterns that we see if you use the NgRx entity library. And hop over to ngrx.io. They have a great guide on NgRx data. And finally, when upgrading to NgRx 8, I ran this just this morning. It is really nice. The ng update provides you it updates all of your dependencies and updates your code. So really easy to use. I recommend just trying it out when you get the chance. Finally, I just want to give you guys some references. Hop over to guide store testing on ngrx.io. I've helped contribute some of the documentation there. Some more documentation is probably needed, so we'd love some more contributors there. My slides are up on my website. I do want to give a big thanks to the NgRx team. If any of you guys have looked at NgRx issues or NgRx pull requests, it's one of the most friendly communities for individual contributors that I've seen. I've had lots and lots of short issues to write and documentation, and they're really welcoming, so I really appreciate the team at NgRx. Finally, I want to thank AngularUP for their wonderful hospitality, and you guys as a great audience. And if you guys have questions, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter at John_Crowson.